chances before you. One by one we will take you.
This is a top 5, or for us, since there's 2 of us, times 2, a top 10. We had a lot of success with the 50s one. And so we said, hey, let's do another decade. And we realized looking at that decade, oh my gosh, we can't do that in one top 5.
It's a
that would
big
be just
one.
impossible for people. So we decided to divide it into a part 1 and a part 2 of a decade. And that decade is the 1960s.
Yes.
Hence our trippy backgrounds that we're having here.
Yeah. And that part 1 being 1960 through 1964, 5 years.
5 years of crazy horror and science fiction. Oh my God.
And not just that, but great movies as well, like average, Oscar-winning type movies. Like Spartacus came out then, The Apartment, The Great Escape, West Side Story, To Kill a Mockingbird, Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Strangelove, Breakfast at Tiffany's, to name just a few.
Yeah. Stanley Kubrick was big in the 60s. So it's awesome. Yeah.
Well, and so were creators like William Castle and Roger Corman and Hammer Films in London. And ironically enough, none of those 3 are in my top 5. Because there are so many. I had the same issue with the 60s, the first half, that you had with the 1950s we did a while back.
Yes.
I had so many horror movies, and I couldn't watch them all, obviously. So I basically have a lot of them in context, and I will mention them, but only the ones that I know of. I kind of just deleted everything I'd never heard of or that really didn't rank with me. So people out there, if you want to mention one that we don't mention, that's feel free to, because there will be some.
Oh, yes, of course.
You're going to need a bigger boat.
I'll begin with a classic, one that we've already done on the podcast. The Time Machine came out in 1960, directed by George Powell. A perennial classic, as a matter of fact. Some people consider this their New Year's Eve movie, and they always watch it every New Year's Eve since it takes place on New Year's Eve. But it is a classic. It's great. We talk in detail about it on the podcast and the YouTube channel episode. But that's my number 5.
It's Rod Taylor and Yvette Mimieux. I love that movie, and I had a lot of fun when we covered that on the podcast as well.
Yeah, George Powell, incredible special effects for that time frame.
Morlocks.
Really good.
Oh, please, haven't you done enough to me?
I paired some of mine up because I told you I have so many, and my number 5 is actually a pair of films. Okay. It's kind of a tie between 2 directed by the same guy, and they are Whatever Happened to Baby Jane from 1962 and Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte from 1964.
Wow.
Yeah, both of these were directed by Robert Aldrich. He's a very strong director, did The Dirty Dozen, and both starred Bette Davis. Both movies were kind of considered B-movie schlock at the time, but both of these movies hold up really well because I just rewatched them. And I think they're very underrated. Not only did they have heavy hitters like Bette Davis, Joan Crawford, and Olivia de Havilland, it's just a treat picking out future famous faces in the backgrounds of these movies. Okay. You will recognize folks. And I was also blown away to know that Baby Jane was nominated for 5 Oscars. I thought that, this was considered a B movie.
I did not know that.
And it won for costumes. And Charlotte was nominated for 7 Academy Awards and didn't win any. But Agnes Moorehead did win a Golden Globe for her performance, and she's fabulous in it. So that's why I had to basically just say number 5's a tie between the 2. I couldn't pick which one.
Good choice, I think, for that era.
Stand by to receive our transmission.
My number 4 is the film version that was later turned into a very popular television series produced by Irwin Allen. It's Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, the 1961 film. It set up the whole premise for the television series. You get to meet, of course, the admiral and the captain and all the good characters in in it. You get to see the flying sub for the first time, and it's science fiction that's not in space. Went on, we always talk about keys. It went on, of course, to inspire things like UFO and some other series that came out, Lost in Space, all the Irwin Allens.
I don't think I've ever seen it.
It's really good. It's treated as a straight drama. So they're just saying, what they do best. They're not saying, "Ooh, we're making a science fiction film." They're saying, "We're making a film about a submarine. It just happens to be an extremely advanced nuclear submarine." And this was in 1961. It's a good one. That's my number 4.
It's just a jump to the left.
My number 4, you mentioned earlier that you had one that we've covered on the podcast. Going forward, we've covered all of mine on the podcast.
Okay.
And my number 4 is Robert Wise's The Haunting from 1963. This one is Robert Wise's take on the classic Shirley Jackson haunted house novel. Fantastic cast. It's got Julie Harris, Claire Bloom, Richard Johnson, and Russ Tamblyn. It is considered to be one of the best ghost movies. And I mentioned this in the podcast, along with another movie called The Innocents from 1961 and one called The Uninvited from 1945. You have to like a slow burn, less special effect type movie. But for that kind of movie, this movie is really effective at scaring you without showing you very much. It's all mood and tension.
You ever dance with the devil in the pale moonlight?
My number 3 might surprise you a bit, but after reviewing it, finding it on my list, kind of paring stuff down, putting them in order, seeing it, I went, okay, I need to watch this again. So I watched the trailer. The trailer starts out with, "This movie is scientifically accurate." And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to watch it now. And rewatched it, and that's not true.
It's not true.
But no, at all. But it does have it tries to be. For the time. This movie came out in 1964. It was directed by Byron Haskin, and it's called Robinson Crusoe on Mars.
I love that movie.
I do too.
Yeah,
I watched it again. I really liked it. It stars Paul Manti. It's also got a very young Adam West in it, pre-Batman, and it's got some really great concepts to it. I love the fact that they kind of have this isolationist feel with him, and he's really got to carry the bulk of that movie. It's almost like Castaway.
It's like The Martian in modern standards.
The Martian in 1964. Perfect comparison. Yeah, that's a great key.
And I think we used that as a key when we covered The Martian. So now we just need to cover Robinson Crusoe on Mars.
We do. It needs to be on. I know it's on our list. I just need to push it for next year, probably. So
that's a good one.
This is weird, Mulder.
Very weird.
My number 3 is from 1963, and it is my personal favorite of Alfred Hitchcock's films. It is called The Birds.
Oh, boy, is it. Yeah.
This one stars Rod Taylor as well, who was also in The Time Machine, with Tippi Hedren, Jessica Tandy, Suzanne Plachette, and a very young Veronica Cartwright. And they are living in a world that suddenly runs amok with birds out to get us. I love this movie for several reasons. Of course, Hitchcock's just a master at what he does. But I think the number one reason I like this movie is the ambiguity, because nothing is ever explained as to why this is happening. Very much like Night of the Living Dead. So that's why I like The Birds, and that's why it's my number 3.
We do have a system, and it works.
My number 2, I fought between Robinson Crusoe and this one for which would be 2, which would be 3, and they're kind of interchangeable, but I ended up going with this one just because of after we had done the deep dive on the podcast, I kind of went, I appreciate that movie a lot more. It's from 1961 again, and it's directed by Cy Endfeld, and it's called Mysterious Island. It's based on the Verne story. It's just... I just really enjoyed it, even though we talked about it, the problems that we had with it, but also the good points of it.
It's a kid movie. It's a movie you will enjoy much more as a kid. Yeah.
And it's got, Ray Harryhausen giant crab, and it's got some really unique situations in it. Again, it's not a space movie. It's not a science fiction has to be in space or in time travel. This was just a mysterious island and
Well,
kind
and
of
it's
their
also a
extrapolation.
sequel to another famous property as well, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, because Captain Nemo's in it.
Yeah, it's not the best Nemo. Herbert Lom is not the best Nemo in it, but it does have the same design of the ship, the Disney design, including the interiors with the organ and the huge window and all that kind of fun stuff. But yeah,
Yeah, it's a fun movie. And
it is.
ironically enough, we covered it as a double feature with The Time Machine. So
Yep.
clearly we like these movies.
Yep.
Why are you torturing me like this?
My number 2 is a movie I've already mentioned. I mentioned it in a slight tease just a few seconds ago, and it is a movie called The Innocents from 1961. This is
Nice.
Jack Clayton. Yeah, another ghost movie. This is Jack Clayton's take on the classic ghost novel by Henry James, The Turn of the Screw. Stars Deborah Kerr, who I remember discussing this with you on the podcast. I think this is one of her best movies. She's fantastic in it. Peter Wingard, Michael Redgrave, and the young Miles and Flora are played by Martin Stevens, who you'd recognize from Village of the Damned, and Pamela Franklin. One of my favorite memories of this movie, honestly, is when we covered it on the podcast because you had never seen it. And I think it
Right.
kind of blew you away.
It did. Yeah. Yeah. I was very impressed with that movie.
Yeah. So that would be my number 2, The Innocents, 1961.
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
My number 1, you will probably not agree with because I don't know how well you really liked the movie when we covered it. We did cover it on the podcast, directed by Nathan Duran. The last one was based on Verne. My number 1 is based on an H.G. Wells short story. The screenplay was done by Nigel Neal, and it's First Men in the Moon. I love this movie, and we've talked about it several times. I love the British humor in it. I love the characterizations. I love the solenoids and the tech of it. Again, it's a Ray Harryhausen who was really hot in the early 60s.
I was going to say, that's your second
So-
Ray Harryhausen.
Yeah, and he did a lot of the animation, even of the spacecraft and stuff. So I really liked this movie. I think it has some high science fiction concepts, especially at the time of there's actually life, underneath the moon. Edward Judd is in it, Martha Hare, Lionel Jeffries in one of his best parts. He's so funny in it. But that's my number 1 of 1960 through 64, First Men in the Moon. I'm anxious to see what the best horror movie, in your opinion, of that
Well,
year.
it's funny. You've done a lot of pairs. I started off this thing with a pair. You've had 2 H.G. Wells movies. You've had 2 Ray Harryhausen movies. And I'm about to do my second Alfred Hitchcock movie. And my number 1 pick is
See what's on the slab.
Psycho from 1960. What can
Excellent
I
choice.
say about this movie that hasn't been said before? It is the seminal slasher movie. This movie basically started a genre of films, a subgenre, I guess you would say. Starred Anthony Perkins, Janet Leigh, Vera Miles, and like a movie like Night of the Living Dead, it's one of the most influential movies I can think of. And that's what this podcast is about, folks. We talk a lot about influence. And Psycho, to me, would be in one of probably the top 5 influential horror movies of all time. And that's why it made my pick, Little Norman Bates and his mother.
Have we done Psycho?
We did it either the first or second season, so it's not on video. So it's probably due for a revisit.
A redux.
Yeah,
sort
a
of thing.
redux.
Yeah. I think it also contributed. I'm not sure if it was the first because I think Bad Seed might have predated it. A psychological thriller too. It wasn't just a slasher film. It was it led to things like, a key for that would be Silence of the Lambs. That sort of examination of a killer from an external point of view.
Well, and it also had some other first, like the first movie I can recall that killed off the heroine, in the first 30 minutes of the movie or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
I
Oh,
mean, all of a
definitely.
sudden you think your leading lady is, the star, and she's dead in a shower.
Interesting. That's an excellent first choice. That's your number one.
Well, like I said, it was easy to pick the number 1 through 5. For me, what was hard was honorable mentions and all the rest.
Yeah, let's go there. What do
We'll
you
go
have
on
for
to-
honorable mention?
All of my honorable mentions are pairs again, because like I said, I'm trying to give them as much credit as I can. The first one I classified as British imports, and I
Okay.
had not seen either of these movies, and I watched them, and they made my honorable mentions. One,
Really? Okay.
yeah. One is called Night of the Eagle in the UK, but it is also known in the States as Burn Witch Burn.
Ooh, was that Vincent Price?
No, not at all. It is Peter Wingard, the guy that played Quint in The Innocents, and Tansy
Oh.
Taylor.
Okay.
It's a screenplay by Beaumont and Matheson,
Wow.
and it is based on The Conjure Wife by Fritz Lieber.
Wow.
Do you remember that story? That was a big story in the
Fritz
50s,
Lieber was
I think.
great. I haven't thought about him in a while. He was a
Yeah.
great author.
Well,
Yeah.
I tell you what, this movie, it blew me away. I watched it and I was like, wow, why have I never seen this? So I thought maybe I need to revisit this list a little more. And I went to another British movie, and it's a very little known Hammer film called Scream of Fear from 1961.
All right.
And it was written by Jimmy Sangster, who we've covered before, and it stars Susan Strasberg, Ronald Lewis, and Christopher Lee, who Lee claims it's the best Hammer film ever made.
Wow.
It's not a
Outrageous.
monster movie. It is psychological terror, again, about a woman that returns to her home of a rich, estranged father, and yet I guess you would call it, her stepmother is there, but the father isn't. And the father's dead body keeps turning up in places, and she keeps seeing it, but no one believes her. And then you realize it's more of a thriller than a horror movie, I would say, but it's great. So my number one, or one of my honorable mentions, is a pair of movies called Burn Witch Burn and Scream of Fear. Look them up, folks.
Wow.
Number 2, I put down as influential films. And the first one is Carnival of Souls, a 1962 movie that was directed by Herc Harvey. It's a very trippy, haunting film about a woman who may have died in a car accident and ends up wandering around in a nightmarish carnival. People like George Romero have said this movie inspired Night of the Living Dead. So I had to mention it because just of the influence alone. And then I'm going to mention this one, which we have covered, that is not great, but it is one of 3 adaptions of a Richard Matheson property, and that's The Last Man on Earth from 1964.
Oh, yeah.
It was the first adaptation of I Am Legend, and it is another movie that George Romero also said influenced Night of the Living Dead. So both these movies influenced George Romero and warrant being placed in my honorable mentions, I think. So.
Wow. Well, my first honorable mention, you, I think, will appreciate because it does border into your territory a bit, although the conceit underneath it is probably science fiction, although it's treated as a horror movie. It's a little picture that came out in 1960s, and it's called Village of the Damned. And it almost made my top 5. It was really close. I went back and rewatched it again and just went, man, this movie is really a lot better than I thought it was. So atmospheric, so scary, but also so
and George
well
Sanders.
played. Yeah, George Sanders is great in it. Barbara Shelley is in it, but the kids in it are scary as crap. I mean, British children can be somewhat either annoying or scary anyway. Man,
I think you said something very similar when we covered The Innocents, and the kid that plays Miles is the same kid that's the lead in Village of the Damned.
Yes, and so it's obviously him. He's possessed by a demon. But I don't think we've ever covered it on the podcast, so I want to push it on our list.
I agree, and I don't think we've covered Triffids either, Day of the Triffids, and they're both written by Wyndham, aren't they?
Well, that was my second runner-up.
Oh,
My
I'm
second
sorry.
honorable mention, but that's okay. We can go ahead and mention it. The other
Yeah,
one's
just
Day of
go
the
ahead.
Triffids, which was written by Wyndham as well,
Right.
and is a terrifying kind of sci-fi feel of plants come to life. I'm sure that it probably inspired King for Jordy Verrill. It probably has inspired, it was definitely of that era of the 60s when we were afraid of alien invasion and what aliens would look like and what they would do. One of the reasons that Triffitt almost made my list too, and definitely it was in the top of the honorable mention, was because I had read the book before I'd ever seen the movie and was really impressed with the adaptation, the translation, the things they changed, the things they did different, all of that. And I thought it was just a really good telling of that science fiction story. So that's my number 6, I guess.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Top 6. Yeah.
All right. Well, I can't get away without doing a couple more honorable mentions.
Sure.
And the third little pairing I put together are both foreign films, and they are Mario Bava. We have covered one of them, Black Sabbath, and then the other one, which is even more famous, is Black Sunday. They were both released in the early 60s, and Barbara Steele in Black Sunday plays a vengeful witch returning from the grave. And then the one we covered, Black Sabbath from 1963, was an anthology. And along
That's
with
a Jello movie, right? Not Jello.
the middle story is a very choppy, confused Giallo story. But
Giallo.
the first
Okay.
story and the last story are in the horror genre. One is about the corpse of that woman in the bed. It's one of the most terrifying corpses I've ever seen. And the other
So
is
true.
the Verdalag, where Boris Karloff plays a vampire.
Sort of, yeah.
It starred and was hosted by Boris Karloff. It's one of the first anthologies I remember other than 1945's Dead of Night, which we've also covered.
Perfect. Good choice. You just have
So-
multiple choices all over this.
I do. So
Yeah.
folks, if you're listening, you've got a lot to choose from, and I'm about to give you
You
some
do.
more.
There you go.
Do you have anything in context you want to mention, or do you want me to go?
No, I'm ready.
Okay, because you didn't have as many to choose from as I do. All right, folks, I've got these grouped so that, and I'll just list them because I think they bear mentioning. You will have heard of them, I'm sure. First is Wiliam Castle, who was a very prolific producer and director around this time period. In 1960, he did a movie called 13 Ghosts. That's been remade. We should probably pair those up for a double feature.
Yeah.
Homicidal came out in 1961. Mr. Sardonicus, one you mentioned quite a bit as being very scary, came out in 1961. He did Straight Jacket with Joan Crawford that was penned by Robert Bloch. And then he did one called The Nightwalker with Barbara Stanwyck and was also penned by Robert Bloch.
Yeah.
Roger Corman, some of you may have heard of him. He was a very prolific producer and director and also a nurturer of talent. He started his Edgar Allan Poe movies around this time. There were 7 of them: The House of Usher, Premature Burial, Pit and the Pendulum, Tales of Terror, Tower of London, The Raven, The Mask of the Red Death, The Tomb of Ligeia, and one called The Haunted Palace, which was really a Lovecraft one with a Poe title. But that's not all Corman did. He also did The Terror with Boris Karloff and Jack Nicholson, X, The Man with X-Ray Eyes with Ray Milland, and a little movie called Dementia 13, which was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. Hammer films, which were burgeoning, I mean, just swelling huge at the time. They had The Brides of Dracula, The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, which is also known as House of Fright because it was released by AIP over here. Captain Clegg, which I've never seen, but I'm interested in.
Yeah.
The Phantom of the Opera, I believe that's the Herbert Lom version. Curse of the Werewolf. That Curse of the Werewolf is the Oliver Reed version. Night Creatures, The Kiss of the Vampire, which is also known as Kiss of Evil. Paranoiac, The Evil of Frankenstein, which was probably a sequel. The Gorgon, which I watched and is the only horror movie I've ever seen with Medusa in it. And Nightmare. I've got one category that I just put familiar faces because there's people in them we like. One called Night Tide from 1964 stars Dennis Hopper. It's about a mermaid. I have not seen this movie, but it gets really high rankings on Rotten Tomatoes.
Sure.
Okay. I guess it's a scary mermaid. Yeah.
Scary mermaid. Yes.
This one someone mentioned on our 1950s. She didn't realize it came out in 1960. And it's called City of the Dead, but it's also known as Horror Hotel. And it stars Christopher Lee. Another one.
I've never heard of that.
You would recognize the poster, I think, if you saw it. But it is it's weird to go from City of the Dead to Horror Hotel. It sounds like British American, because it's just kind of a stupid title.
Yeah.
This one I really love is a personal favorite. It's called Twice Told Tales. The reason I like it, it's the only anthology film I know that's out there that's based on Nathaniel Hawthorne's stories. Stars Vincent Price.
Sound familiar to me. Okay.
Yeah, it's good. It's got Sebastian Cabot's in it too.
Oh, okay.
It's probably on our list just because I like it personally. There's another one called The Flesh and the Fiends with Peter Cushing and Donald Pleasance, and Diary of a Madman with Vincent Price.
Okay.
I had a couple of Japanese films that I haven't mentioned that I'll probably get some flack for because they are really highly thought of, and I have just not seen them, and I couldn't find them. One's called Kwaidan, and one is called Onibaba. And both of them are often talked about in the horror community as being superior films. Some people are probably going to mention them, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, tell us where we can find them. We'll watch them.
Yeah, for sure. Or tell us about them and your experience with them. Foreign Killers. These movies were, one was probably inspired by Psycho or vice versa. And it's a movie called Peeping Tom from 1960 in the UK. It gets really high rankings, as well as Eyes Without a Face, a French movie about a woman that she doesn't have a face. And I think her father's like a mad surgeon that's trying to steal someone else's face for her. I've seen this, but it's been a very long time. And then we usually mention a few comedies. Little Shop of Horrors came out at the time. Another Roger Corman movie that, of course, went on to influence the stage musical that's very popular today. And The Comedy of Terrors, which is a Jacques Tourneur movie with
cat people.
Yeah, exactly. And it stars Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, and Karloff. And then lastly, I'm going to shut up, but I will say that another person came on the scene at this time, and it was Herschel Gordon Lewis, who was known for doing gore for gore's sake movies. And his movie 2000 Maniacs came out, as well as another movie called Blood Feast. Herschel Gordon Lewis was very low budget, so I just remember them being almost unwatchable.
So for this top 5, I gave 7 and you gave 75 titles. So that works well.
Well, no, for the top 5, I gave 6.
There you go.
For the honorable mentions, you gave 2 and I gave 6.
Okay.
And then I mentioned a lot in context, but folks.
Well, and I think it'll be the reverse once we do the second half of this decade, because science fiction just jumped so huge in the late 60s. So excellent.
Yeah, that's what we got for you folks today with the top 5 of the 1960s part 1. We would love to hear your comments or any other movies that you might have liked that we may have neglected to mention, or if you have any comments on those that we did mention. David and I do Johnny Has the Keys. We do 40 episodes a year where we deep dive into 1, sometimes 2 movies, give our first impressions and what we feel it influenced or was influenced by. You can check those out every Monday. We also have some other side shows like these top 5s. We do some occasionally a Coming to Get You if there's a movie out there that kind of sparks our interest. Or I sometimes chat about movies I've watched on Shudder or I happen to have caught streaming, just little shorts. And I guess that's going to do it for this one. We don't know when the second part of this is going to air, but it'll be somewhere out there in the future. And we would like to thank you guys for joining us.
Please leave us a comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. So,
and we will see you next time.
In the late 60s.
In the late 60s. Groovy, baby.
Start the car, Johnny's